Hi guys, today we're looking at Elizabeth Bishop. So Elizabeth Bishop was born in 1911. When she was 8 months old, her father died. She was originally born, of course, in Massachusetts, rather like Sylvia Plath. And then after her father passed away, she and her mother moved to Nova Scotia in Canada. So her mother was originally from Canada, and her parents, so that would be Bishop's maternal grandparents, still live there. Unfortunately, her mother suffered from mental illness, and in 1916 she was institutionalized. So she was sent to a psychiatric institution or mental hospital, and there she remained until she died. So effectively then, Elizabeth Bishop was an orphan, and her grandparents looked after her until she returned then in 1917 to Worcester in Massachusetts, and she was looked after that then by her paternal grandparents, by her father's parents. So she lived with her Aunt Maud in Boston for a while as well. She went to Vassar University in New York, and she graduated with a degree in English literature, although she studied Greek and music as well. Throughout her life, she travelled extensively and wrote about those particular voyages. She lived in Florida in 1939, and the fish then focuses on that time in Florida. She was a keen angler, so she enjoyed fishing. So we'll see, of course, how the fish then relates back to that particular period in her life. In 1951 then, she decided to embark on a world tour. She went to Brazil first, and she ended up staying there actually. She didn't continue with her travels. She stayed in Brazil then for 15 years. She met Lola Soares then, of course. She was actually a lesbian, and so she met a woman and stayed there for 15 years. And Lota I should say, actually had children of her own. So basically then, she decided to return then to New York when the relationship was failing. Lota then followed her, but unfortunately ended up taking her own life. So in the 1970s then, she was taking classes herself and just basically giving classes in creative writing. And then she died at the age of 68 in 1979 from a brain aneurysm. So basically, the poem The Fish then focuses on her time in Florida. And she's basically looking at, we'd say, a sense of admiration, newfound appreciation for nature at this particular stage. So at the very beginning of the poem then, she describes how she caught a tremendous fish. Now the word tremendous just simply means large or massive, essentially. And these particular fish, of course, we come to realise are Goliath groupers. And Goliath groupers can grow to 8 feet long, and they can actually last essentially. So the lifespan would be usually around 30 or 40 years, sometimes up to 100 years. It really depends. So they are huge fish essentially, and they're known then obviously, of course, as a kind of a delicacy then as well. Okay, so she describes how she caught a tremendous fish. Notice the language here, very simple, very accessible, very conversational. It's kind of like a narrative poem where she's telling a story, but she's offering simple descriptions and observations. So she held him beside the boat, half out of water, with my hook fast in the corner of his mouth. So the hook then was embedded in the corner of his mouth, so he couldn't actually wriggle and swim away. He didn't fight, he hadn't fought at all. So she considers that quite unusual, sort of peculiar as such then, very odd. Why? Why isn't he fighting? Why isn't he wriggling? Why isn't he trying to escape? He hung a grunting weight. Grunting, of course, would suggest how weighty and heavy he actually is. But grunting might suggest, of course, and becomes clearer later in the poem, that he's actually quite an old fish as well. So in a way, then, he doesn't bother to struggle because he doesn't have the energy, he doesn't have the strength. Notice grunting, a very onomatopoeic word. She uses quite a lot of sensuous images in this particular poem. A lot of visual images, aural images. We'll see tactile images later on as well. So he hung a grunting weight, battered and venerable and homely. Battered, of course, I think it's sort of bruised and battered, then injured, obviously. Venerable, he is deserving of respect. So he is a sort of aged creature then that demands respect. Homely is actually quite a negative word to use. It means very plain, unattractive, unappealing, sort of ugly as such, really. So she describes then the exterior of the fish, okay, his appearance, and then she imagines, of course, the interior of the fish, because remember that she was a keen angler herself, and she often caught and she gutted, essentially killed and gutted, and then ate the fish that she caught. So here and there his brown skin hung in strips like ancient wallpaper. So there's a very specific simile here. And if you look at the footage that I sent you then of the Goliath grouper, essentially he has a kind of a cream and brown sort of scaly appearance. Okay, so it's like little patterns or little designs, like kind of speckled or mottled wallpaper, essentially. So here and there his brown skin hung in strips like ancient wallpaper. It's almost like it's peeling away. That would suggest, of course, how old he is. And its pattern of darker brown was like wallpaper. Shapes like full-blown roses. Full-blown just means, of course, roses that have bloomed, large flowers. Okay. Stained and lost through age. So like I said, kind of mottled and patterned, essentially, kind of speckled, essentially. It's almost like age spots that you would find on an older person's face or hands, essentially. Okay, then we're looking at the parasites infested, essentially. So he was speckled with barnacles. Think of the shells, of course, that attach themselves then to flesh, even human flesh sometimes. Usually they attach themselves then to a hull of a ship. Fine rosettes of lime. Lime is a kind of crystal and powder, of course, that would actually accumulate then on objects or creatures, as we see here. And infested with tiny white sea lice. So think of them kind of nibbling and living, of course, on his scales. The fine rosettes, of course, would be a metaphor, essentially, here. So comparing then the crystals and the powder, almost like a badge, essentially, that he wears. Underneath, 2 or 3 rags of green weed, so think of the seaweed that clings then to his skin or scales, hung down while his gills were breathing in the terrible oxygen. The gills, of course, obviously allow the fish then to breathe underwater. The terrible oxygen, it's almost like we'd say an oxymoron, a contradiction here. Oxygen is pure and life-giving. It's essential for life, but here it's terrible because it damages the fish. The fish cannot, of course, breathe out of water. The frightening gills. Frightening, I think here she just simply means that they're very unusual and strange to human beings because the fish use the gills, of course, to breathe in the water. Fresh and crisp with blood, indicating, of course, obviously that he's been injured when she caught him. So he's been cut, of course, and he's bleeding. That can cut so badly. So, of course, the gills can be very, very sharp. They're kind of lined little filaments, but they can cut human skin as well, or even, of course, predators and other creatures. I thought of the coarse white flesh packed in like feathers. So using a very unusual simile here, and if you think about it, if you cut open a raw fish, essentially, then the actual flesh itself is kind of slippery and slimy and translucent. It's only when it's cooked, of course, that you have the kind of flaky texture of the actual fish. So she's still seeing the fish, of course, as prospective food here. Her attitude towards the fish will change, but at the moment, of course, it's just dinner, essentially then. Notice how she's moving from the external appearance then to the internal, and she's imagining or remembering that, because remember, of course, that she did kill and gut, of course, her own fish, her own food. So she describes then the big bones and the little bones, the dramatic reds and blacks of his shiny entrails. The entrails would be the intestines, of course, because you have to gut the fish. You have to take all of that out then before you cook it, before you prepare it. And the pink swim bladder like a big peony. So the swim bladder is, like we say, a little balloon-like structure that keeps the fish buoyant, essentially, so that the fish doesn't sink. So if you think about it, pinks, reds, blacks, they're very vibrant, very bold, very different to the exterior of the fish, which has that kind of creamy brown and green appearance, essentially then. So think about it, kind of ugly on the outside, but fascinating and strange on the inside. I looked into his eyes, which were far larger than mine. So think about large fish eyes, of course, on either side of his head, but shallower, thinner, and yellowed. Think about the idea that he's aging. He's an old, of course, creature at this stage. The irises, the coloured part, backed and packed with tarnished tin foil. So think of that kind of yellowy silver effect. When silver hasn't been polished for a while, I guess that kind of yellow gleam. Or think of tin foil that's been in the oven too long as well. It gets kind of yellowed over time. Seen through the lenses of old scratched isinglass. Isinglass is like a gelatin, like a thick gel essentially. So here's like kind of plastic that kind of covers the eye essentially, but it's scratched and worn. It's like looking through a dirty, grimy window or looking at a scratched phone essentially. Then it's very difficult to see through. So she's emphasizing his age then, how worn he is. They shifted a little, so the eyes kind of moved a little, but not to return my stare. So it's kind of emphasizing the idea, of course, of the fish is dying essentially here, but also suggesting, of course, she's kind of humanizing the fish. He's a he or a him throughout, and she's using anthropomorphism, which is giving human qualities to a creature or animal. So if we think about it then, it's almost like the fish is stubborn or defiant or independent and refuses to give in. He's like a prisoner of war essentially who's been captured, but he's not going to look at you. He's not going to acknowledge your presence. So it's more like a tipping of an object towards the light. In other words, of course, that he is dying, essentially. He's fading because he's old and because he's been captured. I admired his sullen face. So in a way then she admires the fact that he's quite stubborn and obstinate. He's sullen, of course. He looks sulky and kind of grumpy, essentially. The mechanism of his jaw, think of course the mouth opening and closing as the fish is struggling, obviously, of course, because it is dying. And then I saw that from his lower lip, if you could call it a lip, there was a little side there, very conversational, grim, wet and weapon-like, hung 5 old pieces of fish line, of 4 and a wire leader. The wire leader is the line that connects the fish hook and the fishing line. So it's an old-fashioned fishing rod then, essentially, of course, that she's using and the people would be using at that particular time. So what does she notice? She noticed that in its mouth then, it still has 5 hooks. Now they've been made, of course, of steel. Essentially, back then they could have been made from bone, of course, or stone even. And then from each hook, then you have a little line, clearly indicating that this particular fish was caught 5 times before, but managed to escape 5 times. So it's emphasizing the idea that he's almost like a soldier, a warrior, essentially, a veteran, a soldier that has seen great battles and wars and has managed to survive. So essentially, then she admires the fact that he is strong and that he has survived before. Once more, she's humanizing the fish, of course. He becomes a soldier rather than just a creature as such too. So the 5 big hooks then grown firmly in his mouth, a green line frayed at the end where he broke it, because obviously he'd snapped the line, of course, when he managed to wriggle and swim free. 2 heavier lines, so thicker fishing line there, or wire. Think about, of course, he managed to escape lots of different types of fishing rods then, of course, and fishermen. And a fine black thread still crimped. Think of it kind of waved or curled from the strain and snap when it broke and got away. So it's kind of emphasizing the idea then of its strength, of its agility, of course. So she has a kind of a grudging admiration of this particular fish at this particular point of the poem then. It's not just, of course, a creature that she's going to kill and eat. It becomes something more than that. It becomes to represent nature itself and how resilient and strong and fascinating nature actually is to her. Like medals with their ribbons frayed and wavering. So this is the soldier or warrior image again here. Because think about it, you get medals for courage in battle. So it's almost like the fish hooks with the lines look like medals that you would attach then, of course, to a military uniform. And then the little multicolored ribbons. So they're frayed, of course, so the idea that they are, obviously, that they've been broken or snapped. So essentially that there are thin little lines left behind. And wavering, kind of fluttering in the water in the breeze. A 5-haired beard of wisdom. So if you think about it, she's comparing then these little lines to a beard, essentially, that an old wise man would wear. Another word for an old wise man would be a sage, S-A-G-E. Trailing from his aching jaw. I think the soreness, essentially, then, of course, because of the hook. Not just, of course, because of the 5, but her fresh fish hook that has been deeply embedded then in the flesh of the fish itself. I stared and stared, and victory filled up the little rented boat. So think about it, she's not just talking, of course, about her victory in catching or capturing a fish. Now it becomes the fish's victory because her attitude is changing. She is no longer sort of arrogant, essentially. She is no longer triumphant. Look at the fish that I caught. Look what I'm going to do with it. Essentially now she becomes more modest and more humble, and she begins to appreciate this particular aspect of nature. It may just be, we'd say, an ugly fish to other people, but to her it comes to represent more. It's more about the strength and the power and the beauty of nature itself. So from the Pool of Bilge, so she describes then the interior of the boat itself. It's just a little wooden rented boat. So we think of the bilge then would be like the dirty, filthy water. You usually get little pools of it, of course, you know, they kind of splash into the boat. And it's mixed then with the oil from the motor as well. So the Pool of Bilge, where oil has spread a rainbow. And think about it, a rainbow is something very beautiful and colourful. So you have things that are kind of grimy and ordinary, essentially, a little bit grotty, but out of that comes beauty. And rainbow, of course, or rainbows can represent the beauty after a storm. So the beauty after ugliness, or they can represent harmony as such then. So it's emphasizing the idea, of course, that even in just an ordinary, humble aspect of nature, you can find beauty and harmony. You can find understanding. So her perspective is now new. It has now changed, essentially. So we have the oil then spreading like a rainbow around the rusted engine. Think of an old engine then, of course. To the baler, rusted orange. Think of bright colours here again. The baler simply is the bucket that you'd use then, of course, to get rid of the water that accumulates at the bottom of the boat. The sun-cracked thwarts. The thwarts would be the little benches, the wooden benches that you would sit on then when you're rowing the boat. Essentially, think of sun-cracked, maybe paint peeling or little lines that appear in the wood as well, because think of Florida, of course, very intense sunshine. The oarlocks on their strings, so the oars would be secured then on either side so that they wouldn't slip and fall into the water. That's really what she's emphasising there. The gunnels then, of course, would be the edges of the wooden boat. So until everything was rainbow, rainbow, rainbow. So she doesn't see, of course, the ordinary, rather mundane, rather ugly aspects of the fish or the boat. Everything has become illuminated. Everything has become changed and transformed because she now has a greater understanding. It's almost like she identifies with this creature. She appreciates the creature. And she feels sorry for the creature, but she also admires the creature as well. So she's kind of emphasizing then almost like a connection between herself and nature. And then think of the last few lines. Everything was rainbow, rainbow, rainbow. Everything was beautiful and harmonious. Everything had changed, like the rainbow after a rain shower. And I let the fish go. So why does she let the fish go? Why does she allow it then to swim off away from her? Why doesn't she capture it? Why doesn't she kill it? Because she no longer feels triumphant. She feels rather humbled. And she says to herself, why should I exploit this aspect of nature? Why do I want to kill and abuse nature? So it's a greater understanding and a greater appreciation of all of the facets and aspects of nature here. And in a way, she is in tune with a kind of feminine attitude towards nature. If you think, we'd say there are very sort of macho, very masculine attitudes towards nature that you'll find in The Old Man and the Sea or Moby Dick. The Old Man and the Sea, Ernest Hemingway, for example. So the idea of sort of like killing to feed oneself. It's the idea of battling nature. Here she is seen simply in harmony with nature. And in a way, there's a kind of quiet reflection then towards the end of the poem. It's an anticlimax when you think about it. And I let the fish go. And in a way, she's showing her admiration then for this particular fish that had fought so bravely 5 times before and was now just old and simply worn, the battered and venerable fish as mentioned at the very beginning of the poem. So she feels like he has earned his escape. He has earned, it's almost like a little retirement essentially then off the coast of Florida. So if you think about it, some very simple themes in terms of appreciating nature, understanding nature, also the kind of the maturity of the poet as well, maybe an environmental theme to respect nature as such, a kind of ecological theme there as such. And the idea maybe of, we'd say, Elizabeth Bishop maturing in her attitude, and the idea that nature is not there to be exploited or to be used, but nature is there to be appreciated, to be understood. There's a depth to nature perhaps that we don't necessarily consider or that we don't appreciate most of the time. Okay, so that's just an overview of the fish. So the next time we'll have a look at the prodigal. And remember, if you have any questions, don't hesitate then to email me. So see you next time, guys.